Welcome to Chapter 17, where we're going to be talking about the effects of shocks to the new Keynesian model. In the previous lecture, in Chapter 16, we talked about the new Keynesian model. So I went through the setup of it. I talked about some of the assumptions that are behind it that really necessitate the differences between this and the real business cycle model. And then I gave a quick glimpse of what the graphical system would look like and really what the main difference is, which is the upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve. Now, there's another difference of the expected price level versus just having a price level in the real business cycle model. We'll get into that in the next couple of slides, so there's no real rush on that one. But let's get started, shall we? So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to graph out responses to shocks in the new Keynesian model. So the idea behind it isn't that different from the real business cycle model. Like I said, there's just this upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve that will give us the possibility for real responses to nominal shocks. So it's building upon the real business cycle model, and it's sort of assuming that the real business cycle model graphs out the long run effects of these things, and that the new Keynesian model is giving us the short to medium run effects of things. So ultimately, both are necessary. They're just giving us different pictures, or I guess different sides of the same coin, whatever you want to call it. So let's just get started with this. So we're going to be learning about three shocks today. The first two are demand side shocks. So we're going to be looking at an IS shock, and then we're going to be looking at a monetary policy shock. Both of these will be triggering aggregate demand shocks, but they're going to have a slightly different set of effects or a slightly different set of responses to the shock. So even though aggregate demand is moving, the mechanism that is causing aggregate demand to move is going to be a little different. And thus also the causes are different. So the IS shock, it could be something like that investment shock that we were looking at. It could be a shock in consumer preferences where they want to consume more and save less, something like that. It could also be a government spending shock. So if the government's we want to spend a bunch of money now, that would activate through movement in the IS curve. Now, the monetary policy shock, that one's pretty self-explanatory. That's if the central bank wants to inject money into the money supply and try to improve real economic activity that way. Finally, we're going to be looking at a total factor productivity shock, and that's the technology shock that you've seen from the real business cycle model that you learned about in the solo model. Like I said, you'd be seeing that one ad nauseum throughout the remainder of the course. But all three of these shocks are going to have substantially different effects in the short run than what the real business cycle model would predict. The first two are going to have effects on real economic variables aside from just the real interest rate. And the third is actually going to have muted effects relative to the real business cycle model. And we'll see that as we move forward. So first things first, I guess probably second thing or third things third, something like that, whatever, I don't know. This is going to be the equilibrium in the new Keynesian model. So with the real business cycle model, I gave you the 4 graphs. This time I'm giving you the 5th graph. So I figured you got the chance to learn about the 4-graph system, learn what the mechanics were there, and I can add an additional graph here. So this way you can get a little bit better of an idea of what's going on, and you'll be responsible for all 5 of these graphs rather than just the 4 for the real business cycle model. But as you can see, it's ultimately not all that different, aside from that, I have pretty colors now for the graphs instead of just all just black and white. We've got our labor demand, labor supply, so we got our labor market stuff. We have the output curve. We have that little translation line where we've got Y equals Y. We have aggregate demand, aggregate supply, IS, LM. So the difference is, we've got a short run aggregate supply that's upward sloping, and we've got an expected price level. So this little PT with the superscript E, that's the expected price level. And then we also have the actual price level. So the actual price level is what we are operating on, right? That's where we are at any point in time. The existing price level is this PT. Now, the expected price level is something a little different, right? That's what we expect prices to be. Now, in the absence of any shocks, in the absence of any movement of any of these curves, the price level is equal to the expected price level. However, because prices are sticky, you can end up having a change in the price level, and the expected price level is going to be slow to catch up, right? So that's going to be the slow moving pricing component in the new Keynesian model, and that's really what is going to be separating this from the real business cycle model. So now that we've seen that, first shock that we're looking at is a shock to the IS curve. So this is where an aggregate demand shock is going to be originating. So first, the IS curve is going to shift outward, which is going to increase the demand for output, and it's also going to be increasing the interest rate. So in the ISLM space, that's where we're going to see our first little bit of movement. So the interest rate is going to be increasing up to RT1. You're probably going like, what the hell is that? Well, let me just go ahead and skip over to the next slide just for a second. All right, what's happening? I'll tell you what's happening. First, IS0 is the initial IS curve. IS1 is the new IS curve. So we're shifting outward. If you follow the direction of the mouse, it's moving this direction. So we go from this nice little light blue over to this cool little orange. Go Tigers. And at this point, obviously, there is going to be, because we've got this upward sloping LM curve that isn't moving, we are going to be at a different level of output and a different interest rate. Interest rates will go up, and the demand for output will also be increasing. So interest rate increases to RT1. Well, we go from RT0 up to RT1 here. And then we're going to draw a dotted line down from this ISLM intersection, this new ISLM intersection. We're going to draw it all the way down to where aggregate demand and aggregate supply are. Now it's going to go all the way down to where it is perfectly horizontal from the intersection of the long run aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply, and aggregate demand. So we draw it all the way down to where we could just draw a horizontal line over to this current and expected price level. So then we're going to draw that dotted line downward into the ADAS graph, which right here is orange curve, or this orange dotted line. And we're going to do so, like I said, until we're perfectly horizontal from where the price level equals the expected price level. This has inflation and expected inflation. My mistake here, guys. It's supposed to be the price level. And this is going to tell me exactly how far the aggregate demand curve will be shifting over. So we shift the aggregate demand curve over by the horizontal amount that the demand for output has increased by. So aggregate demand shifts over to the right, and it's how much output would change if prices were perfectly sticky and there was no ability for an adjustment in price. So what does that mean? That means if zero prices can change, output would move by that amount. However, prices aren't that sticky. They're kind of sticky, but they're not super sticky. So what happens? Well, aggregate demand shifts outward, and you're like, okay, well, this is going to be our new equilibrium, right? Because this, expected price level and, ISLM stuff. Okay, this has got to be it. This has to be the new equilibrium. Well, unfortunately, it's not. Why not? Because aggregate demand and aggregate supply aren't equal to each other here. So this means that the prices have to respond. So we're going to hike over from where the current and expected price levels are equal to each other over to the new short run equilibrium, which is where the new AD1 equals the short run aggregate supply curve. And this is going to be at a price level P1. So we would like to be here, but we can't be here because there's no equilibrium with supply here. So what do we have to do? We have to move along this aggregate demand curve until we get to our short-run aggregate supply curve. Now, when aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply are equal to each other, this is the short-run equilibrium. Because it's only a short-run equilibrium, we have this new price level. This is not an expected price level. This is just a new current price level. We will not get this PT1 equal to PTE, or the expected price level, until all the prices have responded, right? Every single price in the economy can respond to the shock. Then the price level will be equal to the expected price level. But if we look, the IS and LM curves are now no longer in equilibrium. What do you mean? It's like, of course they are. Well, actually, no, they're not. So here, at this level of output, they are in equilibrium, but we're not at this level of output. We're over here. Because remember, we've got to be in an equilibrium in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply space. So if we draw a dotted line up, well, there's an LM curve here, but there's no IS curve. So what has to happen? Well, let's think about this. Prices increased, right? Okay, so if we have something with an increase in prices, let's jump back really quick. We have an increase in prices. Something's got to move in order to get us back into an equilibrium in both of these spaces. Well, the IS curve isn't a function of prices, but if you recall, the LM curve is a function of prices. How does LM move with response to changes in price? Well, if the price increases, then the LM curve is going to shift inwards. All right, remember, so prices decrease, LM shifts out. Prices increase, LM shifts in. So what's going to happen is the LM curve is going to shift back a little bit, but it's going to shift back by just enough to where we can draw a vertical dotted line from AD1 equals short run aggregate supply to an intersection between the IS and LM curves. What does that look like? Well, it looks like this right here. So the LM curve shifts from this green curve inward up to this blue curve. So you're like, well, isn't that shifting out? Well, no, it's shifting in, right? If it were to shift out, it would go this way, but it's shifting in, so it's going this way here. So it shifts in, right? And it shifts in until it is in intersection with the IS curve, the new IS curve, which then means we have an intersection between aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply. And then what happens to the real interest rate? Well, the real interest rate increases again. So the real interest rate increases twice in response to an IS shock. So we just draw that dotted line over to find our new interest rate, RT2. So in terms of the ISLM aggregate demand, aggregate supply space, this is what a response to an IS shock is going to look like. So if the government's like, hey, we want to spend a bunch more money, let's say, I don't know, COVID spending bill number 37 comes in and they're like, we want to spend even more money this time, then, well, you would get something like this, right? It would be government needs to spend more money. If they do so, it originates in the IS curve shifting outwards. So the IS curve shifts out as the government engages in some kind of spending, whether it's deficit finance spending or if it's like, they had a surplus built up and they spent that surplus. Because remember, Ricardian equivalence, well, I guess in this case it doesn't always hold. In most cases it doesn't hold. So let's just say debt financed spending. So debt financed spending, which of course then drives the real interest rate up, and the LM curve is going to shift inward a little bit. This is what the response, the short run response to an IS shock looks like. So I was kind of rambling there, but at the end of the day, short run response to an IS shock. Please forgive me. It's like almost 10 o'clock at night, and I'm not a night owl anymore. Used to be, but not anymore. Okay, so now we've determined output. So we can go on to the supply side of the model. And there's going to be an increase in the demand for output, right? So short-run aggregate supply has to respond by making more stuff. So firms have to respond by making more things because more people want more things. So that means more production is needed. And there's going to be a shift in labor demand. So what do? Well, here, once all the stuff has been determined, then when we have this equilibrium here, we can draw the dotted line down, over, and up. We shift labor demand out until we can get this equilibrium right here, which of course is going to increase the wage rate, and you can see it increases production. So because we have an upward sloping short run aggregate supply, because prices are sticky and not all the prices can respond at once, if there's an aggregate demand shock caused by a movement in the IS curve, we will get real economic effects in the short run. So this is, in theory, a good argument for fiscal policy shocks, right? For like a fiscal stimulus package. If, we go into another recession, if there's another COVID, something like that. This would be an argument for it because in the short run, you can increase output, you can decrease unemployment, you can increase wages, all at the very small to moderate cost of increasing prices and increasing interest rates. That's not so bad a deal, is it? Well, it really depends. Depends on a lot of things. In this particular model, it really depends on the slope of the short-run aggregate supply curve. So I'll tell you what. Play around with the slope of that short-run aggregate supply. Make it really steep, and then make it really shallow. And trace out the responses given the elasticity of short-run aggregate supply. Now, what would that elasticity really be in this case? Well, it's actually a measure of how sticky the prices are. So the stickier the prices are, the flatter short-run aggregate supply is going to be. Because it means if prices are sticky, right, they can't really fully respond. So if there's a demand shock, prices can't move up all that much because not every firm can increase their prices. So in that event, what happens is firms have to produce more stuff in order to satisfy that demand shock. So you'll get more of a response in output, in wages, in labor, all that, given the, muted ability for firms to respond by raising prices in response to an aggregate demand shock. So yeah, just play with that on your own. See what you get. I bet you'll be pretty interested. I bet the results are going to be pretty interesting for you. So let's move on to a monetary policy shock. What's going to happen here? Well, first, the LM curve shifts out. So with the IS shock, it originated, obviously, in the IS curve. Now it's going to originate in the LM curve. So the LM curve, remember, it is a measure of the liquidity preference of money. And it's a function of the money supply and prices. If the money supply increases, well, the LM curve is going to shift out. So with an increase in the money supply, LM shifts out along that downward sloping IS curve. It's going to be increasing the demand for output, and it's going to lower the interest rate. So the interest rate is going to fall from the initial interest rate, R0, down to R1. And then we're just going to draw a dotted line down, similar to how we did in the IS shock. So instead of the IS curve moving this time, we have movement in the LM curve first. So the LM curve shifts out. It goes from the pink over to the blue. The real interest rate falls. Because the real interest rate is falling, aggregate demand shifts out. And because prices aren't fully or completely flexible, perfectly flexible, aggregate demand shifts out. We've got this short-run aggregate supply curve that's upward sloping, right? This is because prices aren't flexible. And there's going to be some kind of a real response. Now, how much of a real response? Well, if you remember from the IS shock that I illustrated just a couple of minutes ago, right? Aggregate demand shifts out horizontally, equal to the amount that the LM curve shifts out and maintains equilibrium with the IS curve. Okay, so this is where we would like output to be, right? But prices aren't this sticky. They're kind of sticky, but they're not super, like, duper, pooper, scooper sticky. They're only kind of sticky. So we'd like to be here, but there's no equilibrium here. There's an equilibrium here, yes, but because short-run aggregate supply is upward sloping and not just totally horizontal, we can't be in an equilibrium here. So we've got to move up until we get to the equilibrium between aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply. So the LM curve, remember, shifted out because the money supply increased. Aggregate demand curve shifts out, no longer in equilibrium. How do we get back? Well, we've got to move back along that aggregate demand curve until we get to the short-run aggregate supply. So the price level is going to increase, but not by the amount that it would have in the real business cycle model. Because if we cut back for a second, if we were to trace out where it would go in the real business cycle model, price level wouldn't be here. The price level would be here. But what's happening is we're going to end up at a price level in the short run that is in between here and here, which is, boom, right there. So the price level increases. But remember, if the price level goes up, the LM curve is going to be shifting in. The price goes up, LM shifts back. So it's going to shift the LM curve back to LM of P2 and M1. So the LM curve initially shifted out because the money supply increased, but now it's going to be shifting back in because the price level goes up in response to that aggregate demand shock. So aggregate demand shifts out, no longer in equilibrium. Price level has to go up, but like I said, not by the amount that it would have in the real business cycle model. So the LM curve shifts back inwards. So remember, the pink was the initial LM curve. Blue is the second LM curve. Orange is the third LM curve. I would say final, but it's not really because this is just the short run, right? Long run would really be the final. But let's just say, at least in terms of the short run, this would be the third and final LM shock or LM movement. I don't want to say shock. There's only one shock, and the rest are just sort of movements in response to the shock. So the LM curve moves in until we can draw this dotted line down from where IS and LM are in equilibrium to where aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply are in equilibrium. This gives us a price level of P1 and a real interest rate of R2. So what happens here? So the money supply increases. Because the money supply increases, we get a reduction in the real interest rate. It shifts aggregate demand outward. As we would like output to be here, it can't necessarily be here because prices do have to respond at some point. So we move from here up to here. So output does increase. Output increases by this horizontal distance between this pink curve, long-run aggregate supply, and where short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand are intersecting, right? So output goes from here to about here. As that happens, the real interest rate fell, right? So let's say you just follow the path of the mouse. So the real interest rate fell, and then it kind of increases a little bit. But it increases to a rate that is still below where it was before. So because the real interest rate responds here, aggregate demand shifts out. We get an intersection between aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply. It gives us a real economic response. Thus, what's happening is monetary policy is transmitting from the nominal side of the economy, the stuff up here, it's transmitting from the nominal side down to the real side via movements in the real interest rate. So when I had said that the real interest rate is the transmission mechanism of monetary policy, this is how. Because the failure of the real interest rate to respond to where it was allows for movement in output. So when I say transmission mechanism of monetary policy in the new Keynesian model is the real interest rate, well, it's right here. This is how you can see the illustration of that particular transmission mechanism. So we settled at an equilibrium where the interest rate increased a little bit above what it would have been in the totally sticky price scenario, but it's still below where it was before the shock. Now, because output increased, this is going to feed through, and we're going to get an increase in labor demand and reduce unemployment, just like what we saw in the government spending shock. So we trace that over from here, down, over, and up, and you can see we get a reduction in unemployment, which means an increase in employment, an increase in the real wage rate. Prices go up a little bit, output goes up and the real interest rate falls. So if you're like, okay, well, what's the difference between this and a government spending shock? Because, well, let's see. What is the difference? Output goes up, right? Prices go up, so you get an increase in inflation. Because output, the production goes up, you get a labor demand shock. Labor demand increases, so hours worked and the real wage increase. So if we were to just draw like little up and downs for all of these endogenous variables, what variable would be different? Take a look at this for a second. And if you want to flip back in your notes for a split second, look at the government spending shock, be my guest. But you will see that there is one variable that doesn't respond in the same direction. Now, I would be like, I'll give you 60 seconds and hum out the Jeopardy theme or something like that, but you can always push pause because thank God to the miracle and the magic of YouTube. So you can always push pause. So go ahead and push pause and think about it. Flip through your notes. Do what you will. And welcome back. So here is the answer. What is the one variable that's different? It's the real interest rate. When there's a government spending shock, the real interest rate increases. The short-run response of the real interest rate will be above what it was prior to the shock. Now, in the monetary policy shock, the real interest rate falls, and it settles at a rate that is below what it was prior to the shock. So if you're looking at it just in terms of like what goes up, what goes down, the only difference that we're seeing between a government spending and a monetary policy shock is the movement in the real interest rate. Government spending, real interest rate goes up. Monetary policy, real interest rate goes down. So which one is preferable? Which one is more effective? Well, this is where we have to get to the real world data, which, I'm kind of talking out of my ass at this point because I don't have any of that data on hand to show you. I can't just be like, oh, here, flip to the next slide. I've got it on hand, but it's just, it's not prepared in the lecture here. But ultimately, monetary policy seems to be more effective than fiscal policy for a lot of reasons. I've kind of gone through some of it, like the timing, the ability of the speed in the response, things like that. But there are other reasons as well. So ultimately, monetary policy appears to be more effective than fiscal policy in actually stimulating demand and trying to stabilize demand and to, when necessary, increase output and reduce unemployment. So those are the differences between the monetary policy and fiscal policy shocks. Cool. 2 out of 3 shocks down. Let's talk about the total factor productivity shock. This one I'm going to be a little quicker running through. It originates the same way as the real business cycle model. So it starts in the production function, but from there, things change a little bit. See, before, with that vertical aggregate supply curve, demand really had no determination in output, but now it does. So what we do is we're going to draw a dotted line over to the aggregate demand, aggregate supply stuff first. So we get this shift in output, right? This is the first thing that happens. Next, what do we do? Well, once output shifts up, dotted line goes over and up. Now, you'd be like, well, why isn't long-run aggregate supply shifting out all the way over here? Well, we're moving the short-run and the long-run aggregate supply curves out. And if you notice, this blue dotted line isn't moving all the way out to where long-run aggregate supply is. It's actually moving out to where short-run aggregate supply is. So the short-run aggregate supply shifts out a little bit. We settle here first. So this is the new price level, PT1. Now, it's not equal to that expected price level, E of P0. So if you ever see E of P0 or E of P versus P with that little E subscript, they're the same thing. Just slightly different notation. So the price level does fall, but it doesn't really fall by as much as it would have if there wasn't that pesky short-run aggregate supply curve and we immediately went to the long-run equilibrium. So price level doesn't fall by as much. Output clearly doesn't increase by as much. So when we trace everything over and back up, we get a labor demand shock, but it's, again, not by as much. Wages will increase, but, again, not by as much. So we'd like to be where LRAS, or long-run aggregate supply, equals aggregate demand. Unfortunately, we have to settle where short-run aggregate supply equals aggregate demand. And then what's going to happen is the LM curve is going to shift out by the amount that output moved in order to maintain that equilibrium. So the LM curve shifts out so that we can draw a dotted line directly from where LM and IS intersect down to this y equals y curve, over to the new production function, and then up to labor demand. So ultimately, it all still leads to similar qualitative responses, but the quantitative responses are going to be different because the amount by which these guys move isn't the same as it is when we have just a long-run aggregate supply curve and there is no short-run aggregate supply. So a couple of things to remember here before we wrap this lecture up. First, the LM curve is going to shift out if the central bank increases the money supply. The LM curve shifts in when the price level increases. So if you're like looking at these shocks and you're trying to figure them out and you're like, I don't know, like something's going on, the LM, like, I don't know, there's not an equilibrium, but the price level went up. Well, if the price level went up and the LM curve hasn't moved yet, or at least it hasn't moved lately, take a look at that and consider what the LM curve can do for you. The amount the LM curve shifts in is going to be a function of how many prices can increase or decrease, right? Shifts in, prices go up, shifts out if prices go down. The ability of prices to move is going to determine the ability of the LM curve to move, whether it moves a lot or it moves a little. And remember, after any shock that we're looking at here, in the short run, aggregate demand is going to be equal to short-run aggregate supply. Just ignore the long-run aggregate supply for now. That'll show up in the next lecture, but for right now, aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply need to be equal. When those two things are happening, chances are you're on the right track. So, more things to remember. In the short run, we can increase output a little bit, which reduces unemployment and increases prices only by a little bit, in response to a total factor productivity shock. Now, in terms of the government spending or the monetary policy shock, output is increasing only by a little bit, but relative to the real business cycle model, it's actually increasing by a lot because, well, it didn't increase at all in the real business cycle model because, well, it would only move in response to real shocks, not nominal. So that would be beneficial in the case of a recession. Government or the central bank can come in and try to increase output by moving demand around. But notice something. In both of these policy shocks, so here's the monetary policy shock, right? Notice there's no shift in production. There's no shift in aggregate supply, whether it's short or long-run aggregate supply. Why is that? Well, very simple answer to what might be considered a complicated question. And it's that printing more money doesn't actually increase the productivity of an economy, right? If you have more money, you're not like, oh, well, I've got more dollars now. So, well, there's just more stuff that can, that was magically couldn't be made before and now it can be. No, you still have finite resources. So printing more money doesn't make resources become less finite. They're still just as finite as they were. It's just that prices can't all respond, so firms have to produce a little bit more in the short run until they can all respond with prices. So it's not like this magical trick where they can make stuff appear out of thin air by just printing money. Now, there are some modern monetary theory leaning economists that would try to tell you things like that, but don't listen to them because they're absolutely insane. Okay, so monetary policy shock. Printing more money doesn't just make resources appear out of thin air. Okay, well, maybe that one's not the most controversial thing in the world, but this is where things are going to get really controversial. You guys ready? Are you ready? Okay. Government spending shock. Do you see any shift in short run, long run aggregate supply and the output curve? No, you don't. Why is that? Oh, yeah. A government spending shock also doesn't make things appear out of thin air. Again, it is taking advantage of the inability of firms to raise all of their prices at once. So it's not going to just lead to prosperity if the government keeps spending and spending and spending. Just like if the central bank keeps printing and printing and printing, it's not going to lead to prosperity. There are limits to these things because resources are still finite. So it's not like they just make, they add more resources to the world when they increase their spending or they increase the money supply, something like that. They might like to tell you things like that because, it makes them feel good to feel like that they did something. But at some point we have to say, look, just hang it up. We're going to give you a little certificate, a little badge going, hey, you did something. You accomplished something. Give our little congressman a pat on the head and then just send them on their way because they can't increase the productivity of firms. A government spending shock is not a technology shock. Technology shocks will increase the productivity of firms. That will lead to that shift in the production function, which then leads to a shift in long run and short run aggregate supply. That will be a permanent change in real economic activity. And as we will see moving forward into the next lecture, that will be a permanent response, but the IS and LM shocks are not going to be permanent. That will not have a permanent real economic effect. That's only temporary. Think of it like this. In terms of the government spending shock, this is really the best way to put it. In terms of the government spending shock, right, if they're borrowing money, you can say, all right, well, they're borrowing money from firms that would otherwise like to invest, but now they can't invest because, the government's spending it, crowding out effect. Okay, yeah, great way to think about it. Here's another way to think about the exact same concept. They're borrowing from tomorrow. So they're taking prosperity that could be there tomorrow to try to offset misery today. Now, in a lot of cases, that's actually, the pragmatic side of me would say that in most cases, that's probably a fair trade-off. But the thing is, we have to be aware of these things. We have to be aware of what we're actually doing. Because, like I said, there are limits to monetary and fiscal expansion. So with all of that said, I'm really teeing everything up for the long-run responses, which will be in the next lecture. So stay tuned for the next lecture. Thank you for watching this one. I hope you enjoyed everything, and I will see you in a couple of days when we do more stuff from Chapter 17. So thanks for watching.